All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for sticking around for the final panel, and a massive thank you to the Wolf Humanities Center, to Ayako, to Caitlin, to Austin, to Pamela, to everyone who is part of the organizing team. I'm thrilled to be here today and to be in conversation with you all. And I'm already seeing quite a lot of resonances between this talk and the conversations that have been happening throughout the day. I hope I won't disappoint you by sharing that this talk is actually not about auto theory, which is the monograph that I am currently at work on. It's actually part of a new project, so bear with me. It's the beginning of a new project on translating trans and queer aesthetics. So I'm eager to share a kind of early version with you. Queer keeps drifting all over the map, wrote Heather Love in 2009. One reading of such a map could, as Love does, plot the indexical indeterminacies of the term, its desirous reach and devious twists. An alternative approach could point to the conditions, material, geographic, social, political, under which queer bodies drift, or are forced to drift, dispossessed and displaced on a map drawn by colonial modernity. The two readings in question, queer as semiotic proliferation, queer as embodied materiality, echo a definitional conundrum at the core of the term, a curious catch-all that ostensibly encompasses myriad possibility on the one hand, and a material history of persecution on the other. While studies in the field of queer migration interrogate how global regimes of power regulate the movements of gendered, sexed, and racialized bodies across borders, the queer in queer migration studies tends to get reduced to an identity signifier, one which nevertheless signals how intersecting axes of colonial and capitalist power direct the flow of bodies across time and space, unequally repositioning them within and against the nation state. Nevertheless, linear migration narratives of mobility, acculturation, and even queer identity formation and belonging ironically continue to reproduce the normative citizen subject. So, despite the critique of normativity that's implicit in Euro-American queer theory, oh no, hold, oh, backwards. Oh, there we go, here we go, okay, let's try again. All right, dramatic pause. So despite the critique of normativity implicit in Euro-American queer theory, quote, North normativity, in fact, instantiates the North as the place where theories are produced, the South as the place of importation of those theories. The North becomes the subject of knowledge. The South is still positioned as its object. Put otherwise, queer keeps drifting. But this normative North-South trajectory of queer theory reproduces the very borders that queer as a politic calls into question. The challenge that this talk faces is thus threefold. First, I seek to surface the untranslatability and incommensurability of queer as it migrates across borders, bodies, desires, and languages. More specifically, I look to Cuíer. That's spelled C-U-I-E-R, and I'll signal that through the Brazilian pronunciation Cuíer. So I look to Cuíer as a Portuguese language neologism that recasts the Anglophone queer with respect to Brazil's modernist literary and cultural history. Second, I'll examine how migrant aesthetics are queered by the 13 titles of Brazilian modernist and migrant Clarice Lispector's final novel, A Hora da Estrela, The Hour of the Star. Third, and finally, In a discordant echo of Mika Ball and Glenda Carpia's intervention, I'll propose the phrase queered migrant aesthetics to underscore not only how migration queers subject and nation, but also how migrant aesthetics themselves are queered by the truths they produce in translation. Queered migrant aesthetics repudiate the reproduction of the normative citizen subject while reckoning specifically with readerly accountability. That is, an accountability that ranges across the very north-south divisions that queer theory calls into question. So even if we know by now that the English language nomination queer, Q-U-E-E-R, is not a monolith, the Anglophone term, with its particularly Euro-American political history, also possesses what Aki Cuíer calls, quote, a null residence for the Spanish and Portuguese speaker's ear. Not only is the word queer unpronounceable, but it does not carry the history of reclamation embedded in the English. Pedro Paulo Gomes Pereira has asked, quote, does the persistence of the Anglophone term queer signal a geopolitics of knowledge production in which certain people formulate theories to be applied to others? North normativity, in other words, North normativity, in other words, turns the term inside out, reproducing the kinds of subjugation that queer claims to subvert by definition. That being said, rejoinders and reclamations have been quick to follow. In 2021, Two Lines Press published the landmark bilingual anthology, Cuíer, C-U-I-E-R, Queer Brazil, bringing together queer poets and writers across 4 decades, including Tatiana Nascimento, whose Afrofuturist poem, Queer Paradiso, translated by Natalia Afonso, rhapsodizes over a quotidian queer, one that could evade state surveillance. It could be, the speaker imagines, quote, less of all that makes us listless, hopeless, trustless. Like other poems in the collection, Queer Paradiso yearns for less of what has caused Brazil to garner the highest LGBTQ murder rate and the 5th highest rate of femicide in the world. For the speaker of the poem Queer Paradiso, it would be, quote, less desperate, less agonizing, less surveilled, less. More than a phonetic transliteration, then, queered, like its Spanish language cousin, queered, and that's spelled C-U-I-R, it points to the untranslatability of the term while underscoring its cultural and historical specificity. Queered is a speculative imagining of a less violent horizon of embodied materiality. If we are serious about queer, write Manuela Lavina-Spiek and Maria Amelia Viteri, we must queer nuestro habitus académico also. What would queering our academic habitus entail? Would it, in fact, compel a queering of the queer? I want to take us to the title page of a text that stages a series of imaginings of that less we were just talking about. But first, let me offer a little bit of context. In a geographic inversion of the Great Migration in the US, the northeastern exodus in Brazil brought millions of mestizo migrants from the drought-ridden, impoverished northeast to the industrialized southeast between the late 19th and late 20th century. Among them was author Clarice Lispector, whose family fled the pogroms of the Soviet Union and who grew up speaking Yiddish at home and Portuguese with a foreignizing lisp. So, quick note that in Brazil, including in academia, authors and public figures are almost always called by their first names. So I'll follow that convention in this talk and refer to Clarice, and I mean Clarice Lispector. Okay. So Clarice's posthumously published 1977 novella, A Hora da Estrela, The Hour of the Star, though itself a migration narrative, has no linear acculturation plot, no notion of upward mobility, no chance of belonging. The heavily metafictive and semi-autobiographical novella features circuitous and contradictory commentary about the relationship between writing and death. The triangulation of its author, Clarice, the narrator, Rodrigo S.M., and the protagonist, Macabea, are all three of them are migrants from the Northeast, and all three move south to the big city, to Rio. Rodrigo SM, scholars have done a lot of work on what do these initials stand for, and there seem to be like two overarching answers to this question. One, sujeito masculino, masculine subject, and two, sadomasoquista, sadomasochist. Okay, so that's our narrator. So Rodrigo SM, Rodrigo, masculine subject, sadomasochist, is a novelist who ironically and parodically paints himself as the oppressed, tortured victim of his character, Macabea, rather than the other way around. Macabea's doom is spelled out from the start. She is an anti-heroic orphan, unaware of her own life circumstances. In fact, her material and psychic poverty in the novella represents an aesthetic problem for Rodrigo S.M.'s narration. He asks, why do I write? Well, sometimes the form is what makes the content. We might say, and I hope we can talk about this in the Q&A, we might say that borders are a form that differentially produce the content of migration. But the form I'd like to focus on begins with the literary. A Hora da Estrela, The Hour of the Star's title page displays an array of 13 alternative titles to the one that appears at the top as well as on the cover. The options run down the page like a poem, alternating with the word or appearing between alternatives. In addition to Clarice's signature, a further inscription among alternatives. So let me just read the alternatives. The Hour of the Star. It's all my fault. Or The Hour of the Star. Or Let her deal with it. Or The Right to Scream. Clarice Lispector. As for the Future, or Singing the Blues, or She Doesn't Know How to Scream, or A Sense of Loss, or Whistling in the Dark Wind, or I Can't Do Anything, or Account of the Preceding Facts, or Cheap Tearjerker, or Discreet Exit Through the Back Door. The pronouns in these 13 titles complicate Rodrigo S.M.'s embroilment in a metafictional narrative he is consciously guilty of and occasionally apologetic for penning. The first alternative, The Blame Is Mine, seems to offer a penitent self-reproach that could be for any number of potential crimes. For metaphorically killing Macabea, for claiming that she metaphorically killed him, for his inability to tell the story, for his persistent entreaties for forgiveness for this crime, and for his many, many other tragic flaws. Sujeito masculino, sadomasoquista. Okay. Unless, of course, the blame belongs to someone else, perhaps, per se, the author, or to the reader, for their complicity in consuming the narrative of Macabea's migration and imminent death. The 10th title, Eu não posso fazer nada, I can't do anything, ironically refutes the confession in the first title. it's all my fault. The reader can't do anything to stop Macabea's doom or Rodrigo's violent depictions of it, even as he attempts to attribute her inevitable fatality to the problems of narrative and language itself. The 13th title, Discreet Exit Through the Back Door, ultimately reaffirms his withdrawal, denial, and negation of the narrative role that he himself has played in the story of Macabea's death. Let's try this again. A reading that understands she as Macabea could observe that the thought of the future sends or leads Rodrigo S.A.M.A. to lament the fact that Macabea, quote, doesn't know how to scream, and this evokes, quote, a sense of loss. As for the future, well, that, after all, that's also Macabea's final words before she dies in the novel. Opening, which appears within the narrative itself as her death is being described. Let's try again. Alternatively, a reading of she as the author's self-referential admission would align her with Macabea rather than with the first-person metafiction. Is this an authorial scream, as the image of Clarice's signature appears to imply, a protest against the racialized and gendered violence inscribed in this and other migrant narratives? Is this a scream against the material consequences? The alternative titles on the title page inculpate the implied reader as complicit in the extraction of the migrant narrative they consume. Postulating that the blame belongs to the implied reader produces the following series of conjectures. Macabea's inability to claim her right to scream is exploited by the narrative order, and the reader, this time implied as the I who cannot do anything, likewise lets her fend for herself. The reader has extracted an hour of pleasure from consuming the story of a migrant whose only moment of stardom occurs when the masculinist mouthpiece, the narrator, recounts her death. They say form is what makes the content. But here's a weird thing about futurity. Shortly after visiting a doctor who foretells her death, Macabea visits Madame Carlota, a sex worker become fortune teller. Madame Carlota recommends to Macabea as she is dying that she should be sleeping with women, since, quote, love between women is so much finer. In a twist, however, the fortune she goes on to tell is a highly heteronormative one, complete with a rags to riches plot courtesy of a wealthy blonde foreigner. But here, our protagonist, Macabea, just moments before her death, senses a destiny and responds like this. And this is narrated by Rodrigo about Macabea. In a sudden gush, explosion of a vivid impulse, Macabea, half ferocious, half clumsy, planted a crackling kiss on Madame Carlota's cheek. She felt again that her life was already getting better, right then and there, because it was good to kiss. When she was little, since she didn't have anyone to kiss, she'd kissed the wall. When she caressed someone else, she was caressing herself. Madame Carlota had gotten everything right. Macabea was stunned. Only then did she see that her life was miserable. Half climax, half Cuíer. Here is a moment to echo Nascimento's poem of imagining less poverty, less starvation, less abuse, less narrative loneliness. A gush of desire is released, explosion, and I'd be happy to say more about the parenthetical explosions. A lot to say there. A gush of desire is released, explosion. It does not get planted on a wall, but a cheek. In a vivid impulse, she kisses a Cuíer life so much finer. It is perhaps the revelation of misery that ultimately kills her, as she steps outside the fortune teller's office and the blonde foreigner, as foretold, arrives in a yellow Mercedes and hits her on the street corner. So, to summarize, just after the possibility of a queer life explodes in a gush, one migrant runs over another. North over south. If form is what makes the content in this novella, then its aesthetics nevertheless tell a tale that arguably aims to repudiate the reproduction of a normative migrant citizen subject. Coined by cultural theorist Mika Ball, migratory aesthetics encompass forms of displacement that produce intercultural spaces of encounter with otherness across multiple temporalities. Nevertheless, the metaphoric dimensions of understanding migration as an indeterminate spatial and temporal movement risk effacing how migration is unevenly distributed across South and North, across the historical and structural conditions that have produced these very divisions in the first place. The who, the where, and the why of migration matter. Drawing on Ball's concept, Glenda Carpio has recently offered the close but distinct phrase migrant aesthetics to describe literary forms that reject the empathy model of commodifying and consuming the other's migrant experience through reading. For Carpio, migrant aesthetics account for forced migration as a global phenomenon, an ongoing consequence of the transatlantic slave trade, genocide, and colonialist warfare. In contrast to triumphant migrant narratives of acculturation, mobility, and belonging that reproduce the normative citizen subject, Carpio's framework lingers with aesthetics that challenge readers to confront their complicity and accountability in the empathy model of consumption. My proposed supplement to this framework, thanks to Clarice, is a queerding, I trip over it myself, that transpires with and through these 13 titles in translation. It is not, in other words, the singular or iconic author who gives voice to the migrant experience. Instead, for Clarice, these 13 titles generate shifting vantage points, and these positions stage a confrontation with what we earlier discussed as North normativity, pointing to the queer place of the relationality in multi-directional movements of migration. It is not enough, in other words, to note that migration could potentially queer subject and nation alike. Rather, migrant aesthetics are queered by virtue of the transnational encounters they produce in translation. Queer keeps drifting all over the map, as Love writes, and contrary to one of Clarice's 13 titles, language contains no back door through which to make an exit. But as for the future, bilingual anthologies like Cuíer Brazil seek to imagine one. The speaker of Nascimento's poem explains, quote, "The continent that made up the world made up many ways to be in the world. In that world invented by the continent, one might read Clarice making up Rodrigo, making up Macabea, making up the hour of the star explosion. But one may also translate other ways to be in the world, other forms of drift across the map of queerness, such as when a kiss queers the truth of an otherwise impossible future." Thank you.
So I will try to keep this quick because I realize we are quickly running out of time. I feel like I'm only the most recent in a long line of people who have struggled to get this to work. Is there a particular, or is there maybe Okay. Got it. Thank you. We can just stay here. Perfect. Thank you, Ayako. Okay, so in 1966, a Russian-Ukrainian Soviet writer named Anatoly Kuznetsov published one of the most significant Soviet accounts of the Holocaust on Soviet territory with his novel document, Roman Dokument, Babi Yar. The book's original publication opened with the words, quote, "This book contains nothing but the truth." To begin with the statement in 1966, however, must have carried a painful sting of irony for Kuznetsov. Both Soviet editions of Babi Yar, released prior to 1970, were disfigured, some might say, by censorship. And it was only after defecting to the West in 1969 that Kuznetsov was able to publish the definitive edition of his book and join the pantheon of Soviet dissidents in the West. Now, despite the fact that Kuznetsov was able to publish the uncensored edition of Babi Yar upon his relocation to London, censorship remained an extremely important part of the text. The writer embedded the practice of censorship as a fundamental aspect of Babi Yar's ethical and political reframing after his immigration, most visible in the bespoke typography that he developed for the 1970 Western publication. Quote, this is at the end of the novel's preface. The different sections of the text are distinguished in the following way. Ordinary type, material published in Humanities in 1966, the literary journal in which it was originally published. Heavier type, material cut out by the censor at that time, enclosed between square brackets, material added between 1967 and 1969. And just to show you a quick example of what this looks like in the text itself. So in the translation, the English translation, the excised material is in bold, and the Russian, it's in italics. So that's the one little discrepancy there. But you can kind of see the brackets and then the italics and the sample text on the right side of the screen there. Now, this innovative typography allows Kuznetsov to highlight and reclaim the editorial process, enabling him to incorporate the censor's red pen into his revised and revived manuscript. Reincorporating these sections that purported the original text, Kuznetsov introduces an ethical imperative that runs throughout the novel that multiplies the concept of Babi Yar's truth, layering a documentary story of the Holocaust in Kiev with the subsequent struggle to tell that story in Soviet literature. Kuznetsov not only suggests parallels between Nazi and Soviet power, but he also sates a Western thirst for battered but surviving Soviet texts. By establishing this value opposition between the writer and the Soviet literary industry, Kuznetsov casts Babi Yar in terms of its historical truth value, and by extension, its commitment to speaking truth to power, an ethical quandary that takes hold in what I call Kuznetsov's ethical pact with the reader. Since its uncensored publication in 1970, Babi Yar has had a successful afterlife in both the original Russian language text and in many various translations, and has been rightly acclaimed as an important work of Holocaust and Soviet dissident literature. Indeed, as recently as 2023, Mellon publishers resurrected Kuznetsov's work in the wake of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and republished the English language edition of the book, complete with an introduction written by Masha Gessen. Alongside translations and public-facing reviews of the text, excellent scholarship has recently been produced about Babi Yar and its place in Holocaust literature and the literature of witnessing. However, there remains a need for a closer examination of the novel's form as an intersection of aesthetics, politics, and ethics. And in this talk, I argue that Kuznetsov establishes what I conceptualize as an ethical pact with readers that induces them to share in the memory of the Holocaust on Soviet soil as witnesses themselves. So this ethical pact is kind of what I'm conceptualizing as ethical positions that authors, Kuznetsov in this case, takes within a text, and the formal and narrative strategies used to communicate ethics, these establish an implicit ethical relationship between the writer and his readers. This is sort of the foundation of the ethical pact, and Kuznetsov relies on the discursive and perspectival forms of both literary and documentary discourses to merge history with literary representation as a call to political action. His case demonstrates the centrality of narrative form as a tool of political and ethical resistance to Soviet power and as a means to reckon with traumatic pasts amid uncertain futures. And Kuznetsov's example is a case study in my broader project that investigates the unique ethical conditions endemic to war, and the ways in which these conditions impacted literary production in Russophone contexts. And more broadly, I'm interested in how narratology matters beyond the scope of the academy, and how it really enriches our understanding of the real lived relationships between people and literary culture. So, who was this guy? Anatoly Kuznetsov was born in Kiev in 1929, where he lived throughout the Second World War under Nazi occupation. And he recorded his experiences in a diary. He sort of after the war, had a successful literary upbringing. He was a member of the Union of Soviet Writers, a Communist Party member, published a number of sort of socialist realist texts in the 1950s. But his most enduring work remains Babi Yar. So as I mentioned, after he emigrated to or defected to the United Kingdom in 1969, he allegedly smuggled film rolls that contained Babi Yar's original manuscript, which is when he was able to sort of publish this uncensored edition. And he kind of republished it again in various forms until his death in 1979. The novel document Babi Yar describes the massacre of Kiev Jews at Babin Yar, it's this ravine in the city, and the broader Nazi occupation of Kiev during the Second World War. It involves two primary modes of narration, both of which are central to the ethics of representation embodied by the text. The first mode is Kuznetsov's witness narrative that is focalized through his autobiographical teenage protagonist and is narrated by his adult voice of the 1960s. And it's really motivated by this ethical imperative to remember. The second mode comprises witness narratives of survivors of Kiev's occupation that are focalized through the third-person perspective. The interplay of these two representational modes forms the foundation from which Babi Yar's narrative develops, at times overlapping and running alongside each other in a tapestry of diverse perspectival discourses. Now, Kuznetsov, as a figure within the text, persistently questions his status as a witness, and therefore whether he can adequately provide an ethical accounting of the survivor's experience of Babin Yar and the occupation of Kiev. Babi Yar, thus, is a hybrid text, in which Kuznetsov's first-person narrative is merged with other discursive documentary techniques, including the testimony of other Holocaust survivors, inserted archival documents, such as newspaper clippings, and it's these additional historical materials that really supplement the most obvious lacuna of Kuznetsov's personal testimony, which is the murders at Babin Yar themselves. Resultantly, documentary and literary creation mediate one another in an implicit assertion of the book's truth value. Now, for all the effort that Kuznetsov exerts to situate his story within a broader documentary paradigm, his own witness narrative is a key source of Babi Yar's ethical value. His first-person narration often blurs the boundaries between two distinct registers of witness, the очевидец, the one who saw, and the more legalistic свидетель, the one who's able to deliver a factual statement under oath. Now, as argued by literary scholar Maxim Schreier, this epistemological strategy was one shared by several different Soviet Holocaust writers, including people like Ilya Selvinsky, who's one of, if not the first, Soviet poet to document the mass murders perpetrated by the Nazis in the Soviet Union. So, but like Selvinsky, Kuznetsov firmly embodies both Russian terms meaning witness, очевидец, and свидетель, which he, while he repeatedly presents his narrator as an очевидец to the events that unfold throughout the course of the novel, Babi Yar, as a text, is explicitly a novel of свидетельство, of witnessing. Near the beginning of Babi Yar, Kuznetsov positions his work in terms of its testimonial value as evidence in a hypothetical trial that might pick up where Nuremberg left off 20 years before. He writes, "I'm writing the book as though I were giving evidence under oath in the very highest court, and I am ready to answer for every single word. This book records only the truth." Engaging with the language of oaths and witness testimony, Kuznetsov conveys the ethical importance of his task, to provide a truthful account of the events that took place so that judgment may be rendered and justice may be served to the victims of Babin Yar. He contextualizes his first-person narrator. He was there, he was a local, an observer, and a witness to the atrocities that took place. The ethical value of the knowledge gained from Kuznetsov's first-person witness narrative is grounded in the idea that truth however he conceptualizes it, is a good in and of itself, and as such constitutes this firm moral ground on which that justifies Babi Yar's act of свидетельство. Kuznetsov formulates its ethical and aesthetic principles in explicit relation to the epistemological value of his topic. I'm writing this book now without bothering about any literary rules or any political systems, frontiers, censors, or national prejudices. This book records only the truth as it really happened. Kuznetsov's proposition that Babi Yar offers some sort of unmediated access to the events described therein suggests, perhaps problematically, that his text might somehow function as a site around which historical memory may be induced in the contemporary reader. For Kuznetsov, the process of storytelling, the novel, is in and of itself the document. In order to solidify Babi Yar's claims to a documentary discourse, Kuznetsov features several third-person testimonies belonging to survivors of Babin Yar and the nearby concentration camps. Most prominent among these third-person narratives is the story of Dina Bronicheva, an actor in the Kyiv Puppet Theater who managed to survive a mass shooting at the Babin Yar ravine. Her story possesses a really particular historical resonance as well, because it was one of the only, and therefore most retold survivor narratives of the massacres. Now, beyond the valorization that Bronicheva's story offers Babi Yar's documentary value, it functions as a conceptual and thematic core for Babi Yar as a whole. Kuznetsov begins the eponymous chapter in which Bronicheva's story is present, called Babi Yar, by introducing Bronicheva, his relationship with her, and emphasizing the fact that he was able to transcribe her story after having personally interviewed her while preparing his novel document. He emphasizes that the value of Bronicheva's narrative lies in its transmission of fact-based truths. He introduces Bronicheva. There was one woman who managed to escape from Babi Yar itself at the time, Dina Mironovna Bronicheva. The mother of two children and an actress at the Kyiv Puppet Theater, she's the only eyewitness to come out of it, and I am now going to tell her story as I wrote it down from her own words without adding anything of my own. This phrasing evokes earlier statements made by Kuznetsov's contemporary first-person narrator that posits a factographic value of the novel, such as, remember this opening line of the production, everything in this book is the truth. By introducing Bronicheva's story in a documentary paradigm shared by his own first-person narrator, Kuznetsov creates a context for the reciprocal production of veridical discourse in Bronicheva's story, in his rendition of her story, and by extension in his own autobiographical narrative. Reproduced in the third-person perspective, Bronicheva's story is presented not only as a witness narrative, but as a documentary account of the massacres. Bronicheva's narrative is detached from the subjectivity of Kuznetsov's first-person narration and suggests a concern for a more expansive historical narrative. Simultaneously, however, the addition of Bronicheva's narrative implies a limit to the evidentiary value of a single first-person witness. In the language of the courtroom, Bronicheva's story provides direct testimony to the Holocaust by bullets. In addition to its status as a historical document, her narrative reproduces privileged knowledge that can only be known to survivors. In this way, her story resonates with what Roy Scranton calls combat gnosis, the transcendental knowledge that combat provides through the traumatic wound or encounter with death that is the criterion for determining who can speak the truth. By retelling Bronicheva's story in a manner that evokes oral history, Kuznetsov's implied author suggests a certain type of transcendental knowledge that comes only with the direct experience of the historical event as such, here surviving the mass shooting, attesting to the story's value as documentary evidence of the massacres carried out. Following Bronicheva's narrative is a short postscript that probes further the relationship between narrative and ethics, illustrating how Babi Yar's communication of its humanistic value materializes in its ethical pact. Namely, it asks the reader to consider the relationship between narrative and the living subjects who make narrative possible. In this short bit of text, the novel's narrator briefly explains that Bronicheva survived the war by hiding in a nearby village and relates her life in the intervening years, including the fact that she testified at the post-war Kyiv tribunal in 1946. These details cement Bronicheva's narrative within an externally verifiable historical model. Through the postscript, Bronicheva becomes more than her story, and Kuznetsov's narrator makes an ethical turn toward her status as a legal subject and human being. Rather than reproducing Bronicheva's story as testimony untethered from the person behind it, Kuznetsov emphasizes the fact that Bronicheva was a real person who continued suffering after the war, an experience that was shared by many like her. This very small edition merges documentation with a humanistic ethics, a recognition of the human condition that makes witnessing possible, and of the humanity of those who are behind acts of witnessing. So, to quickly conclude, I want to suggest that by concretizing the historical experience of the Holocaust in examples other than his own, a process that was only fully possible in an exilic context, Kuznetsov demonstrates an ethical commitment to the other. Such a commitment simultaneously validates the other's suffering, their humanity, and recognizes the importance of their witness testimony in the production of a novelistic documentary account of the Holocaust in Kiev. The hybrid model that sees Babi Yar as both a literary text and a documentary text attempts to produce a poetics of anamnesis, simulating the witness experience for the non-witness reader. This in turn expands the ethical pact between the implied author and reader to include a real-world obligation on the part of the reader that they never forget, even if they had never experienced that which must be remembered. This narrative strategy invites readers to actively participate in the production of Holocaust memory, with Kuznetsov's text providing a model for how that process might actually work. Thank you.
My dissertation, which I completed just this summer, and which is titled Between Imperial and Anti-Imperial, the Case of the Georgian State Museum from the Early Bolshevik Period until Perestroika, was an inquiry into the endurance of imperial power in the non-Russian periphery of the Russian and Soviet empires, the Caucasus, the region that has long served as a testing ground for imperial policies concerning modernization within these expansive empires. How empires manage modernization is a long-standing historical concern, also among historians of the Soviet Union. My research brings a new approach to ongoing debates on the nature of Russian and Soviet imperialisms, one centered not only on human actors, but on the interactions between humans and non-human things, museum objects. Specifically, I examine how hierarchies were both reproduced and contested through the curation of material culture, ancient and medieval antiquities, but also biological specimen within this epistemological realm of the museum. I show how the Georgian State Museum, a revamped 19th century museum of the Caucasus, became an important locus of universal knowledge production under the Soviet power. History of the museum reveals how Soviet Georgian nationalism was anti-imperial nationalism, yet simultaneously rooted in Tsarist legacies. I argue that the museum was actively involved in constructing its own Orient. I also argue that the museum was actively involved in constructing its own Orient, a localized Orient. The scientific categories, taxonomies that museums construct through objects cannot be reduced to discourses. Textiles of the exotic South, stamps for textile printing, and samples of dyed wool used in carpet making, metalwork, and ancient frescoes, and the paint to create the copies of these frescoes didn't merely represent the Caucasus and the Russian Empire at large, they actively constituted it, piecing it together through their very presence. Exploring how peripheral actors engaged with material culture allows me to rethink center-periphery dynamics under imperial rule and the question of agency in new and really fascinating ways. Even under asymmetric power conditions and oppressive realities, political authority in museums is constantly negotiated. For example, through persistent tension between public desire and the museum's exclusive entitlement not only to tell a specific story, but to exclusive entitlement to preserve, which is also sustained with its knowledge infrastructure. This very tension, in my opinion, makes it a unique site for exploring question of agency. The Museum of the Caucasus, which you see on this slide, was established in 1865 in the capital of the Tsarist Caucasus, Tiflis, by German naturalists. Germans were at that time a distinguished class of European service nobility under the Russian Empire. As the first public museum in the Tsarist periphery, it pursued a civilizing mission at this very edge of the empire, at the time when Russian forces were waging wars against the North Caucasian Highlanders. This borderland where Europe meets Asia served Russia's claims in its rivalry with Ottoman and British empires over the East. The pacification of the region's rebel groups was declared a central objective to secure Russia's status as a unique Eurasian power in this geopolitical game. museum was not, however, simply a reflection of Russia's geopolitical ambitions and nationality policies in the region. Rather, it grew out of debates among Tsarist officials, local enthusiasts, and European collectors, all of whom had their vested interest in positioning themselves within this proclaimed project of modernizing imperial peripheries. They debated whether establishing a museum in this part of the empire was reasonable at all. At the time, Tiflis already had an opera house, a local press, and learned societies frequented and supported also by local nobility and bourgeoisie. However, founding a museum required more complex knowledge infrastructure, more resources, and crucially, sustained local engagement and cooperation, not only of these upper classes, but at multiple levels. Interaction with the unruly local populations was regarded as both necessary and deeply challenging. In his report, which is a little bit from later period, dated by 1893, but just to further illustrate the point that this was the persistent problem for imperial collectors, in his report titled On the Peoples and the Prehistoric Antiquities of the Caucasus and Transcaucasia, which was published in the Zeitschrift für Ethnologie, the museum director Gustav Rade wrote, as desirable as it would be to obtain good typical skulls, at least from the people still living today in the Caucasus, it is nevertheless exceedingly difficult to acquire such specimens. All indigenous peoples, especially the Mohammedans and the small tribes of various peoples living in the high mountains, possess the deepest religious reverence for their dead, and skull hunting would here be associated with the greatest danger for the collector. Amidst the growing practice of collecting statistical data on the region, and by statistical, I do not mean here numerical data, but rather this practice of systematic gathering of information for the state, Gustav Rade convinced his entourage in the Tsarist administration to support the establishment of the museum, a project that could be effectively managed by a new type of collector that he personified, brave, adventurous, and energetic, not a cabinet scholar, but someone venturing into the wild and capable of actively intervening to even reshape this imperial borderland. Some members of the local branch of the Imperial Geographical Society were arguing that those objects, particularly large ones that they had under their curation, ancient ruins abundant in this region, or enormous fossils which were coming from different peripheral spaces of the Russian Empire, could be preserved as photographic copies to save space and reduce storage costs. However, objects became central to the original objects and hands-on practices such as taxidermy became central to the emerging pedagogical function of the museum, which required far more than the mere shelf storage of photographic reproductions. Although it was established in the periphery and officially had a regional profile, this museum engaged with global diversity through its archaeological, ethnographic collections, and also natural historical collections, mineralogical, botanical, including specimen from Russian expeditions in Asia. Through this museum, Russia was positioning itself as a global empire. Rade's engagement with landscapes, he was botanist and ornithologist, and with various ecosystems also demonstrates that tropical, for example, in Russian imperial imagination was no longer confined to distant European colonies. It could be encountered and made in Russian borderlands, and often in hostile or unexpected environments. For example, during his expedition in Siberia, which Rade conducted before his deployment to Tiflis, he described the central Amur region as a place where areas afflicted in winter by the harshest cold of a continental climate are nevertheless home to significant number of plants and animals that are almost tropical. When the Tsarist Empire collapsed in 1917, the Marxist revolutionaries who came to power sought to radically break with the legacies of the colonial regime. And museums were viewed with suspicion initially, but as important repositories to reassemble national resources, both monetary and symbolic, of course, museums gradually became important, and they also became key instruments of socialist pedagogy. Yet the Museum of the Caucasus remain very hierarchical space, actively involved in the enterprise of making and unmaking the histories of different nationalities residing in this region. And the early exhibitions mostly featured natural historical specimen. The subjugation of nature by a human was, of course, one of the core precepts of Soviet modernity. And the exhibition program of the museum in the early 1920s gives us an idea of how this repertoire was negotiated at the local level. The Caspian tiger entering Georgian territory from Azerbaijan and eventually hunted near Tiflis was now presented as heritage object, as object of national patrimony. And we can see this in different media circulating beyond the museum, including photographs. At the same time, geographic areas as systems of classification were largely rejected by the Bolsheviks as an imperial mode of categorization, and greater emphasis was placed on creating national historical frameworks and restoring archaeological heritage to the nations that had long suffered under the Great Russian chauvinism. Object ownership claims on collections of the Museum of the Caucasus were made as early as 1920. These ownership claims were made early in Georgia under Georgian Democratic Republic, which was created on the ashes of the empire and was governed by the Menshevik government. These claims were made before such claims became more common union-wide under the anti-imperialist banner of the Bolsheviks, who took over former Tsarist territories. The universalist profile of those natural historical collections of the Museum of the Caucasus was central to the claims advanced by local elites, later serving as museum curators. These claims also drew on the existing infrastructure and existing networks with European museums and research centers. And European ethnographic museums were cited as examples of still preserving their colonial collections to avoid their dissolution and destruction. Under Stalin, from the early 1930s, accent heavily shifted to historical collections, which in fact was very vague category of archaeological objects from prehistory and classical antiquity to medieval period, medieval frescoes, the broader category of Christian art, including icons, manuscripts, ritual vessels, some of which were still used by borderland communities in their idiosyncratic worship practices. At that time, new excavation programs led by local archaeologists also intensified. Objects unearthed on Georgian territory were presented as the heritage of the dominant nationality, Georgians. When displayed, they were intended to convey the evidence of historical truth, while the history of class struggle was illustrated through ethnographic exhibits centering on non-dominant, non-titular nationalities, populations residing in borderlands. Museum was engaged at that time in creating its own Orient, in recreating its own Orient, bound to a borderland and portrayed as backward to be redeemed by the revolution. Ethnographic objects, local heads, and tools of labor were displayed in various stages of their production, emphasizing them as products of labor. And such presentation was different from Tsarist from the presentation at Tsarist museums, but it leaves the impression that these groups were supposedly on their path to modernization, though not yet arrived. The national core culture was presented as one among ancient civilizations, which through its unique position at the civilizational crossroads served as key point through which the Oriental Renaissance reached Europe. 1930s are marked by the increased historicization of collections, as mentioned, and the jubilee dedicated to the medieval Georgian poet Shota Rustaveli serves as a good example here. Rustaveli is an iconic literary figure. Georgian Dante and his union-wide jubilee, 750th anniversary of Rustaveli, was part of the Soviet jubilee celebrations in the 1930s, championing local cultures and their contributions to the socialist modernity. The exhibition of 1937, dedicated to Rustaveli epoch, remarkably spurred an archaeological excavation project, much like Schliemann's search for Homeric Troy in archaeological remains. It aimed to demonstrate to the national public, the working classes who were now offered evening hours to ensure their participation, to demonstrate to working classes what Georgian civilization was about by anchoring it in the medieval period, and Georgian civilization was now replacing Caucasian civilization. For the curators at the State Museum, the preparatory phase of this exhibition became an important arena for voicing their anti-imperial grievances vis-à-vis Moscow, particularly requests. They were requesting a return of objects of Georgian medieval art, textiles, royal attributes, and ritual vessels to Tbilisi. While largely unsuccessful in reclaiming these objects, which curators were claiming was important for the exhibition, curators then began collecting these items locally. Ewers, which are presented on this picture, curated by Georgian mountaineers who had owned them for centuries and used them in their local religious practices, drew particular attention from collectors. They were placed 2 ewers in the middle. They were placed alongside similar exquisite ewers of medieval objects of medieval Islamic art at the corners. By highlighting these visibly Islamic art pieces, museum echoed global agenda of the Soviet Empire at the time, which was vying for influence in the Middle East. Those 2 ewers in the middle, originating from Georgian mountainous region of Svaneti, were believed to have been crafted in Georgia, were believed to be local adaptations and donated to these communities, to Svan communities, by Georgian monarchs in the Middle Ages. Placed in glass case beneath these large frescoes depicting Georgian monarchs, which you see on the slide, on the central wall of the exhibition. These objects were inscribed into the national canon. Central to the mountaineers' community memory, these ewers became point of fierce contestation between Tbilisi and Svaneti. But Svans ultimately managed to successfully reclaim these objects. The Georgian State Museum acted as the legitimate patron and curator of the Orient, and while it was the site of anti-imperialist struggle in Tbilisi, reclaiming Georgia's ancient history and through that mobilizing various agents of subaltern nationalism locally, it was simultaneously creating its own kind of localized version of the Orient, and the boundaries of this Orient were challenged by the communities traditionally curating objects that the center, both national and the Soviet metropole, sought to claim as its own. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Marina, and it was wonderful, all four of you. Today, my question is for Alex. Wonderful presentation, and I was very curious. How did you find Clarice and this queer reading? Because I read Clarice when I was in high school, and I'm Brazilian, so you might have realized we read a lot of Clarice, and but I never see anybody touching this queer aspect, and I really see it now because we have a author that is a woman, and then a narrator that is a guy, very annoying guy, and then we have Maccabeo, which we all love. And I want to see, I would love to see more. How do you find this queer reading a way to help us understand these 3 this section of three people in the same novel together. Yes, thank you.
Is someone else? Oh, yes. All right.
This is for Spencer, and I was just struck by the comparison to Ibusi and Black Rain and the diaries that he used and the atrocities that he's documenting. It's not quite as overt, but I just wonder about what have you thought about that? And there are other novels that have these combinations. It's an interesting genre, and that has a certain kind of power for the reader and for students. So I just welcome feedback on that.
My question was for Professor Dillon. I was wondering more about the interaction between the Supreme Court Justice's decision-making and the decision-making of the courts in general and public opinion, because even though the courts and justices sometimes like performatively say they don't care about public opinion, we know like through U.S. history, like it has factored into certain decisions, sometimes to the point of like political hackery. Like I think of Bill Douglas's decision to vote for Korematsu, even though he's known as a civil libertarian. Just more about like what the justices' decision-making was at the time in that case, and how they were taking public opinion into account, and to what extent.
I think we have 2 more questions. Is it okay if you get 5? Is that okay?
I think it's fine. We should just take them.
Okay, yes.
Okay, I thought that I can talk to you later. I just want to follow up on the genre of witnessing. In my earlier years, I actually worked in Yad Vashem, and I read half of the archive of witnesses in all Slavic languages, including everything that has been written in Polish and Russian. And while my Polish was non-native, so I didn't pick up any linguistic or literary patterns, I was struck by the fact that in those witness accounts, there's a very significant literary element, like from specific wording that they were using to some generic principles. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to complicate even the very genre of witnesses providing their witnessing account, whether they're очевидец or свидетель. So I was wondering how, I'm sure a lot has been written about it, but how do you take this complication into your narrative?
So was there one more question? I thought I saw another hand. Oh, wait. Yes, maybe this over here. All right. There are actually a lot of hands. So sorry. But let me one more question.
So since everyone has at least one question, question for Anna, as part of the organizing team, why or how did you come across border as one of the themes? And I'd love to hear either from you or other members of the team, the relationship between border and truth. Borders.
Maybe I can start by offering a proposition that truth is a border, one of many, and that borders in their arbitrary form and imperialist forms produce various kinds of truths that differentially impact, the material conditions under which people cross those borders. I think my co-panelists probably have much more to say on this, but I'll very quickly respond to your great question about Clarice. It's been shocking to me that Brazilian scholarship has not addressed the queerness or the trans aesthetics in her work. And I'm very interested in thinking not about like Cuíer as sexual identity, but rather as an aesthetic or as a practice of reading, which I think the 13 alternative titles enable. But I would love to talk to you more afterward.
And you need to speak into the mic so people can hear.
To be very honest, it was this seminar talk that made me think more about borders, but I found it help. Like I was thinking about borders before. I just didn't. I guess I didn't articulate it that much in my research. But borders are there because all these objects that I talk about constantly transgress different borders, and they're always part of circulation networks. So I was thinking about borders in the terms, but my intervention and thinking about, okay, how do I put myself in conversation with other panelists and thinking more conceptually about borders, taught me actually about using this term borderlands and borderland communities, which I had really hard time. I have always hard time conceptualizing these groups. They are not ethnic minorities. They are not religious minorities. They are so-called these non-dominant, non-titular nationalities, and there is not much scholarship going on these groups, and not much scholarship going on the region in general. But while we have more on subaltern nationalism of the Caucasus, we don't that much have anything to say about these small communities, and these ownership struggles and contested objects very much tell us to tell different stories, that they had their own struggles and their own identity. But again, having difficulty to conceptualize them, and also borderland can be a problematic term, but I somehow feel it fits more than other concepts what I was thinking about before.
Do you want to go next, or do you want to go last?
Sure, I can go now. The mic is closer to me anyway. So to very quickly address both your questions, Susan, Yulia, thank you so much. So yeah, genre mixing, it's a huge thing. When we're thinking about literature of witnessing and Holocaust literature in particular, it sort of reappears over and over again. And yes, I think that there are different reasons for this happening. In my study of this particular text, I am looking at it in one direction, where it's a documentary text that sort of incorporates these documents in order to sort of bolster the sort of the veridical potential of the text as a document. But you also have it the other way around. So Ilya Ereborg, another Soviet Jewish writer, very influential. He had a novel that he published after the war called The Storm, where he incorporated some of the exact same newspaper documents that Kuznetsov incorporated into Babi Yar. But in that example, it's a fictional text that's sort of creating a document out of fiction, kind of getting back to Julia Alexeyeva's talk earlier, where things can be a document without being non-fictional. But then to this, the question of the очевидец and свидетель, and sort of somewhat not unified, but overlap in language and sort of linguistic discourse that is used by many people to describe these similar events. I think about how in the Soviet context, at least, a lot of the discourse about the Holocaust as a distinct historiographical event in the first place was just kind of like, it was a non-starter. It wasn't a unique event in terms of Soviet historiography, certainly not in the 1940s, 50s, 60s. And so I think that when we have examples of texts that can be published about the events that happened during the Holocaust, things like Kronicheva's story. This is, a sort of ready-made text that's just repeated ad nauseum in all these different accounts. There's scholarship that kind of goes into how this particular narrative was repeated over and over again in different forums by Kronicheva herself, but also by authors who sort of either appropriated or framed her story for different purposes. But I think that, in this case, I'm really interested in the sort of construct of the novel as something that can testify without necessarily having to witness everything that it testifies to. So, you can be a witness, but you don't have to testify. And I think it's interesting that Kuznetsov is kind of trying to do, is playing with that notion a little bit, but in a sort of opposite direction. But I would love to talk about these things more with you when we have a little bit more time.
I'm still mulling over your question about borders, in part because I wrote a dissertation that was all about not thinking about the border as a line, but thinking about how you can reinterpret the idea of a border. And the history of immigration through the journey of a person or a group of migrants. And so it's never a line, but it's something that cuts through the life experience at multiple moments and at multiple geographies, at home, and by that I mean the home country, when you cross like a territorial border, but also in the interior of a country and other spaces. But I abandoned that project despite the fact that I was very much in tune to thinking about borders as far more of a larger conceptual apparatus than the idea of it as like a geographical thing. And the only part I kept was that of citizenship for the book. You blow up your dissertation to write something that you think is sometimes better. And in writing about that citizenship, I think, to kind of like invoke Ige now that she's gone, I would say like I see the law from a differential perspective. I wouldn't say like this is about political hackery. I think that this is the way that law has always functioned in practice and in history. And so for me, it's not just about who you appoint to courts, but it's also the history of those laws that come to inform the way in which people practice them. And that includes the experiences and circumstances people are in. In the moment that we're looking at, the major thing that's kind of in crisis is like the aftermath of the Civil War. So this is the first cornerstone of the 14th Amendment to set precedent with Wong Kim Ark, but there were the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that came together after the Civil War. So the question about the vote wasn't just about the 14th Amendment. The question was also about the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed at this time the ability of all men, regardless of race, if they were US citizens, to vote and to uphold that. So I think some of these justices were thinking about that. They were literally thinking about the question of racial contingency that I brought up, so much so that it's actually in the decision itself. And I think that they were thinking with the long aftermath of the Civil War and what kinds of afterlives the Reconstruction Amendments would have in this moment of the 1890s. And by this time, they're already, when you talk about politics, they're already grappling with the fact that these amendments have been reinterpreted in relationship to the US South in all kinds of ways, including like Plessy v. Ferguson, right? Justifying the concept of separate but equal. And for me, like I see myself as a critical legal scholar, which means like I don't think that there's a liberal notion of like law and it's like going to guarantee that if we practice it correctly that everyone's going to come out equal on the other side. I'm actually interested in the power dynamics that construct law and then its application. And I think that the kind of history that I write speaks to that.
Okay, thank you. One more round of applause, guys. So I'm Caitlin Adkins. I had the honor as graduate associate of organizing with the many people in this room this day of sharing and discussion. And I now have the honor of giving the closing remarks. And I've come prepared. All right. So this symposium is titled Truth in Crisis. A complex topic, yes, but a crucial one, especially for the challenges that confront us in these times. We face a global rise of authoritarian movements that destabilize and suppress truth through the manufacture of and exploitation of crisis. We bear witness in mind and body to violences near and far and always in the palm of our hands. Violence is wrought against the many and the vulnerable to enrich the few. And yet, for all the immediacy of atrocity in this, our digital age, relief and remedy are not as ready as a tap of a screen. In these closing remarks, I admit to you in reflection that I had at one point proposed a subtitle for the symposium with an attempt at relief and remedy in mind. I proposed the subtitle, Articulating Survival. I was trying to confront in these few words, as concisely as the problem of truth in crisis had been identified, the contemporary challenges confronting us all, offering a disciplined sort of hope for untangling, if not surmounting. I was inspired by the work of scholars like Sarah Ahmed, Hannah Arendt, and Audre Lorde, who have sat with what it means to survive dehumanization crises and what it means to share this truthfully with others. I felt that what they offered collectively was an agreement that a step, and a vital one, lie with the art of articulating. What is at stake in observing and communicating crisis? What is at stake in a commitment to truth as a value within those acts? Articulation in the service of survival, the work of survival requires it. Audre Lorde, whose shoulder-straightening self-description in a 1977 paper reads, "A Black woman warrior poet doing her work," provides apt words that I bring to you now. These words are taken out of context, originally in a 1980s reflection on learning from the 1960s power movement, Black power movement in the United States, but I see in them prescience, as well as that something more she offered consistently and resolutely across decades of scholarship and artistry, an invitation and a challenge to join her and each other in a commitment to the work of survival. Within a conflagration of power imbalances and environmental degradation, misogyny, homophobia, and anti-Black and brown racial hatred, she had us start with the deeply personal, which is never individual, and then move out. Accepting responsibility and figuring out what the work of survival is and one's role in it. Lorde writes, quote, "We do not have to romanticize our past in order to be aware of how it seeds our present. We do not have to suffer the waste of an amnesia that robs us of the lessons of the past, rather than permit us to read them with pride as well as deep understanding. We know what it is to be lied to, and we know how important it is to not lie to ourselves. We are powerful because we have survived, and that is what it is all about, survival and growth. Within each of us, there is a piece of humanness that knows we are not being served by the machine, which orchestrates crisis after crisis and is grinding all our futures to dust. If we are to keep the enormity of the forces aligned against us from establishing a false hierarchy of oppression, we must school ourselves to recognize that any attack against Blacks, any attack against women, is an attack against all of us who recognize that our interests are not being served by the systems we support. Each one of us here is a link in the connection between anti-poor legislation, gay shootings, the burning of synagogues, street harassment, attacks against women, and resurgent violence against Black people. I ask myself, as well as each of you, exactly what alteration in the particular fabric of my everyday life does this connection call for? Survival is not a theory." End quote. Within systems that grind so many futures into dust, Lorde notes that there are many that were never meant to survive. In the face of this reality, she implores us to commit again and again to do it anyway, to be a connection in the collective endeavor, and to begin with the self-revelatory, world-bridging, and dangerous acts of looking clear-eyed to the hard-earned lessons of history, reconsidering inherited tools from systems that do not serve us, and transforming silence into language and action. She asks us to reflect on the differences of our confirmed and potential allies, and articulate the truth of intent and need that join us together within real and against manufactured crises. Or, as she puts it, we need articulate power. Lorde urged us to do the work, to do it within ourselves and with each other. How often did she say, in some form, "I stand here now doing my work, asking you, are you doing yours?" In memory of a title that almost was, or a subtitle that almost was, Truth in Crisis, Articulating Survival, I listen to the many here today come together to put language to truth, to think through crisis, and to look to each other for next steps and the courage to take them. From questions of the keynote, how the genres, forms, and conventions we use illuminate the realities of incarceration, how they can reproduce police power and punishment systems or break them open. Panel 1 to the framing of inquiries, theories of depiction, and practices of reorganizing perception that our institutions offer us as bases of learning. Panel 2 to efforts to fabricate and capture in miniature and image the lands and environments that house and transform us. And panel 3 to the frameworks that create borders around identities and how they are crossed to make livable and legible. I find myself grounded, grateful, and also with teeth grit for what comes next. In closing, I express my utmost gratitude. For all their efforts to see this event to fruition, I thank the Wolf Humanities Center staff, Erin, Pamela, under the leadership of Director Ayako Kano and Associate Director Sarah Varney. Thank you to the topic director for the 2025-26 Forum on Truth, Julia Verkolonsev, and my fellow symposium organization committee made up of the postdoctoral and doctoral fellows for planning, moderating, and supporting. I thank our co-sponsors for their support, Penn's Department of Anthropology, English, History, History of Sociology and Science, Philosophy, Russian and East European Studies, the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy, the Center for East Asian Studies, and the Program in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies. To the audience, thank you for your engagement. And to the presenters, thank you for accepting our invitation to be here, gathering, some from further than others, to bring us insight. Thank you all for doing the work. I would like to ask you to join in one last round of applause to thank everybody here today. The reception is next door. Please enjoy light refreshments.